I'm going to talk today about, are we winning the march of cybercrime? And I might sort of answer my own question as I go, a little bit of a spoiler there. Who am I and why should you care? I've been doing crime for about 20 years or a bit more than 20 years. Started out online casinos, the legitimate kind, and banks. Then I went to federal law enforcement for the best part of a decade, where I worked in a crime operations team. So we did a lot of the very high profile breaches and child protection work and that sort of stuff, and malware operations down here in Australia and the Pacific. Now, yeah, I head up the research sort of function for this part of the world. And a little caveat that crime is all I know, really. It's a weird sort of niche I've got myself into, but yeah, I don't know a whole lot of bad stuff on the internet. Um, so when we were talking about running this session, I thought, yeah, a little bit of a history lesson of cybercrime might be interesting to get people up to speed. And then I realized how long I had or how long I didn't have. So you're going to get 20 years in 20 minutes. So buckle up. Um, what I thought I'd do is I'd tackle the history of cybercrime through the prism of loss amount per event, right? So we can sort of see how the technology's advanced, but also the loss amount per event, from my personal knowledge, has exploded basically over the years, and sort of where we started from in some basic history lessons. So because I think people sort of need to know a bit of history. So let's start with 500 bucks. So we're talking about individual fraud events, fraud loss events to a bank of around 500 bucks, $300 to $600 per event. This basically started in around, very early 2000s with what we call dumb phishing. So dumb phishing was an interesting one because at that time, banks, and I will use banks in Australia because that's my personal experience, but banks were only really just starting to move on whole to internet banking, right? So at that stage, the biggest fear that banks had was that customers would lose what we called confidence in the channel. Now, a little bit of inside baseball here. Um, if you go into a bank branch at the time, it would cost the bank maybe $5 in infrastructure and staffing and that sort of stuff. If you went to a bank branch to do a transaction, if you did that same transaction online, it would cost about 5 cents. So obviously the banks wanted to keep people and encourage people to use the online platforms, right? So then when phishing first came around, because all of a sudden these internet banking platforms started to have functionality over and above just checking your balance, they were often, obviously we all remember the really bad English. Often they would have the wrong brand for the wrong phishing type. They were basically dumb PHP scripts that were put up on mostly compromised websites at this stage. So very simple PHP in the back end. The victim would log in, it would write that out to a text file, and then the bad guy would come and collect it manually, and then manually log into that bank account to try and do some sort of transfer. The money transfer at that stage was very local, very domestic, and then maybe they would transfer it to a credit card or a local crony, if you will, if that's not an Australian term, a crony, a criminal associate, and then transfer it out of the country via Western Union or MoneyGram or something like that. So that was how it sort of started. Pretty dumb stuff, just writing it out. Then there came this concept of takedowns, and at the time it was basically begging site owners to please take this content down. You'd email them and say, hi, you've got a bit of a script here in this directory which is infringing my brand's copyright or whatever legalese you might choose to use. Or there'd be a lookalike domain that registered, and you'd go to the registrar and say, hey, this domain is infringing my copyright, please take it down. Oftentimes you'd find that the owners of the sites that were compromised were quite helpful, and they didn't want this stuff there. Maybe you'd tell them, oh, we think they got in via a WordPress bug or whatever at the time, give them a bit of a free security audit, and they'd send you the phishing kit, right? They zip it up and send it to you. So then that's how we started to learn what these phishing kits were, and if the ones that wrote out the text file with the little username and password to a text file, when they got reused, and they'd always get reused, most of the time the crooks didn't change where they were writing out that credential to. So when you saw the same phishing site come up on a new host a week or so later, you knew that if you checked, phishing site /result.txt, all of a sudden you'd see all your stolen credentials for your bank. So, and this went along for a while. Then the bad guys figured that out, and some of them wrote these simple scripts that would not store the credentials locally. They would email them off to a mailbox, Hushmail or Gmail or Proton Mail or whatever it was at the time. And that's how they would harvest the credentials. A little bit more automated. They wouldn't have to then browse to the site. The credentials would come to them. The checking of the accounts was still manual, And people did some looking into this at the time, and really the spams would go out in the morning, the phishing emails, pardon me, would go out in the morning. People will be starting to click over their morning porridge or Vegemite toast or whatever you people eat where you are. And if you didn't really get the phishing site taken down within the first 4 hours, the bell curve of actual credentials being entered into it after the first 4 hours really fell away to nothing. So the impetus to take these sites down quite quickly was very strong on us. But it was whack-a-mole, but it was manageable, right? Because it was single sites, maybe, you know, depending on the bank, you'd get 10, 20, 30 a week, you know, maybe 2 on a good week, and you could manage it. You still have to report up because everyone was panicking in banks about phishing at this stage, but we could keep on top of it. You were starting to get some good intelligence about how the various kits worked and who they were talking to, and from logs you could see who was logging into them to get the credentials, that sort of stuff. So the bad guys were learning as well. So they learned that email was better than local credential storage. But by the way, phishing sites still do local credential storage a lot of the time. So we went from $500 to $5,000 per individual loss event. So when the bad guys are logging in manually to the accounts and trying to pay to a credit card or to a local bank account, they're doing about $500 a time. Bank fraud detections at the time were not infantile, but they were not where they are today. So the banks are playing catch up, trying to see about behavioral analysis and know your customer. All these buzzwords start to come out around banking circles. But then in about 2004, this thing called Rockfish appears. Now, Rockfish was a direct result of takedown efforts of compromised websites and lookalike domains. What Rockfish was doing was, rather than having one phishing site per compromised box or per host, you could have 300 to 400 phishing sites all live at the same time, targeting dozens of banks around the planet, all at the same time. And this infrastructure was no longer just a simple box on either a shared hoster or a compromised website. This was now proper infrastructure. So we had a tiered proxy setup. We had almost most often individual IP addresses that you could target for an IP related takedown. That was a bit harder with some of the less friendly hosting providers, shall we say. But when you did often get an IP takedown and you would rarely get the content of that particular box, all you'd get was an Nginx or an OpenVPN config. There's no content on it because they'd figured out, okay, we're losing a lot of credentials because they can figure out that they can get our stuff. Let's move it now to an arm linked back. This is the first real usage of that concept of tiered command and control infrastructure was around Rockfish. Rockfish was massive for years. It was that early 2000s. Anyone who was in banking at the time will remember Rockfish and the panic when your alert would come in with the phishing domain with /R1 or /rock at the end of it, because then you'd know you're in for a really long day. And a couple of hundred sites you got to take down. That then evolved. So with those IP-based takedowns, we evolved again. The crooks figured out, okay, well, if we now use dedicated criminal infrastructure, there's no more nice site owners to talk to. There's no more, friendly net block owners to talk to, that sort of stuff. It's now mostly, if not all, hosted in what we would call today bulletproof hosting. But at the time, it was sort of, again, infantile bulletproof hosting. But then in late 2006 and then early 2007, this thing emerged called fast flux, right? Now, real quick lesson on what fast flux is. Fast flux threw us all for a bit of a curve because we were used to monitoring IPs and domains and we could keep track of what was going on. With fast flux domain, which is also known as round robin domain or DNS, pardon me, what it does is you query for mybanksfakesite.com and the domain, and you get back 5 IP addresses. Give it a minute, you query from myfakebank.com again, and you get back 5 different IP addresses. You keep querying, and you're getting thousands of unique IP addresses coming back to you from all over the world. So all of a sudden, IP takedowns or any sort of action against IP addresses are useless because it's not just a hosting provider in Moldova or OVH or something like that. It's now someone's home router in Brazil that's hosting that initial tiered, proxy for the connections, and that then makes things very difficult. So then what do? We go after DNS. We start taking down the registrars, the authoritative name servers for that particular domain, that sort of stuff. So the bad guys evolve again and bring out what we call double flux, which is now not only is your phishing site fluxing through thousands of IP addresses, now your name servers are fluxing through thousands of IP addresses at the same time. So it's a real mess. And then there's the concept of triple fluxing, right? So I'm going pretty fast here, but keep up. Um, so at this stage, what we were doing was you would look for a credential that got stolen, and you would then try and see what IP address logged into that credential and what else it logged into, right? Once you recognize one particular fraud event, you lost $5,000. You could then see, okay, well, that account was compromised. We think by this particular attack, what else logged in from that IP address? So you could identify further compromised accounts, a bit of, detective work, a bit of back work. But that then went away with triple flux, because then there was a whole other botnet being used that was also fluxing through thousands of IP addresses. That was the one that was used for the credential testing, the credential logging in. So any sort of IP-based activity or analysis was basically nullified. All you'd get was these three massive circles of IP addresses that were all, I don't want to say useless, but they are, getting pretty close to useless at that stage. But by this stage, the banks were starting to figure out what to do. So things like we could now inject dummy accounts. Depending on where you are in the world, there's different laws around how you can create dummy bank accounts. It's quite strict here in Australia. There's legal frameworks around financial instruments and that sort of stuff. So it's not easy, but when you have permission to do it, you can then start injecting a bunch of these fake accounts, and that would then help you to enumerate this third flux network. So at least you could see some of the extra accounts that were getting logged into. You never fooled yourself that you had full access, because you simply didn't. But banks are starting to build up more and more detection and response capability. So then what happens? Now we move on to $50,000 per event, right? Now this is a big change. So this is 2007, 2008. We see the enter the bankers, the banking Trojans, right? Zeus, Bugat, Nethel, Gozzi. This is back in the olden days. This was now, we're not doing phishing anymore. Now we're doing this lovely fellow here, is the guy who wrote Zeus. We're now doing, we will infect you with malware, and now we're going to use these things called web injects to overlay and alter the victim's the victim's experience with our bank's website, right? So now we're not tempting them to go to a phishing site. We're just going to wait until they browse to their bank, and then we're going to alter their experience. I'll quickly talk about the best I ever saw. Was a web inject that made the customer defraud themselves. When they logged into internet banking, big red button came up and said, "Hi, you've been given money accidentally. You've got to give it back before you can go any further." They'd go to their transaction history. Sure enough, there'd be that transaction of 10 grand, and they'd check their balance. Sure, their balance is increased by 10 grand. They'd go and they'd give the money back to the account and go on with their day. Obviously, that was all fake. What the bad guys have done is they'd use social engineering and a bit of web inject trickery to make the punter defraud themselves. Now, I don't care what two-factor you've got, nothing will stop a victim who wants to give their money to a crook or who wants to do the right thing. So, two-factor tokens, SMS, the victim wants to give the money away. Beautiful, beautiful inject, beautiful inject. But I'm mindful of time. The bank detection started to improve. Banks were taken by surprise by this stuff. Everyone was. This is pretty new at the time, but gradually we got better. We were able to start doing things like browser fingerprinting and looking into the DOM of the browser to look for the inject code. All these types of things we could do. We could start to understand the inner workings of this stuff. So again, this cat and mouse went on. Then a couple of years later, the bad times, we see a new thing emerge. Now we're talking about this thing called automated clearinghouse fraud, and this tool which not many people have talked about or have heard about, called Leprechaun. Leprechaun is an autoponer. Basically, this group that was known as the Jabberzeus crew had perfected now. They'd taken the individual logging in to check the account and doing the transaction manually. They'd taken that out of it. They'd evolved now to when the victim logged into their bank, Leprechaun and the associated scripting would check their bank, would check for their daily limit, would check for their account balance, and would check for their transaction types, and would automatically pick a mule detail, inject it in, and make the transaction. The only information that the bad guys running the Jabberzeus thing got was a notification that, hey, the money has been sent to a mule. Not, hey, would you like to initiate a transaction? It was like, hey, we already sent the money. You need to talk to your mule to go and get the money off them, the money mule, the person accepting the cash. There was really good activity from law enforcement around this time with Trident breach. 50 people across multiple countries, mostly mules, mostly these money mules who were involved in moving the money. And some of the mule handlers who were actually, some of these guys were around back in the day of Rockfish. That's a bit murky. But the mules themselves, the ones that get arrested. Mules are dumb animals. You feel for them, but yeah, so they got arrested at that point. Now we move on. We move on now. We've got this auto ownage going on. We've got this automated transfer of money. We've got automated theft built into these systems. Now we're going to go up to some big coins, right? 6 figures, 4, 5, 600 grand a pop. Enter Game Over Zeus and Dyer. Right now, this stuff builds on all of the lessons of the past and all of the work that we've done as law enforcement and as banks and as security providers. It's now fully automated, massively distributed. All the old little things that we used to poke at are gone away, and they figured out, let's not hit individual retail mum and dad banking accounts for 10, 15, 20, 25 grand. Let's hit business banking accounts. Let's hit wealth management accounts, right? Because they often have 0 daily limits on transfers and pre-enabled internet transfers. And often, if it's the right business, they are often making these international transactions. So your nice heuristics around knowing your customer get a bit harder. So then when you can hit using all of the stuff you've learned before, and you've grown up as a criminals, and you're now hooked in with these professional mule and money laundering crews that do things like moving money for drugs and guns and people smuggling, like actual money launderers. They don't care that you're using cybercrime money. Once you hook in with those guys, now you're moving that 6 figures at a time, right? Now you're really making some money. And we're talking 6 figure. And this went on for a couple of years. Whenever the banks would lose a bit of money, it was a big deal because it was one hit was massive. So activity took place. Operation Tovar, Secureworks was key in that as well, in the takedown of Game Over Zeus. But the takedown of Game Over Zeus revealed this thing called Crypto Locker, right? Now, what's Crypto Locker? This was a bit new. Now we're talking about where we are today, $5 million a pop, right? Now we're talking about ransomware, right? Oh boy. And I'm not going to get too much into detail about ransomware, but suffice to say that moving from traditional cash and moving money around the world traditionally to digital currency movement, you take out a lot of those money mules and those money launderers. So you can keep more than you can move. More than you would normally give up because you give a percentage to the money launderers. So now all of a sudden you're making serious cash per event and you're keeping all of it. Brilliant for a criminal. Brilliant. And now we're at a point where this is now an existential threat to business, because guess what? It's no longer the bank's problem anymore. Before, all of the stuff I've talked about was all the bank's problem, right? Now it's individual businesses that are responsible for their own safety. This is where it's getting very interesting. We can no longer blame the banks anymore. So we're at an interesting stage now where all of this evolution has got us to this point now where the nice hardened shell of a banking platform won't save us. We need to worry about ourselves and our own situation. But of course, old and dumb still works. Some of you might have noticed that initial phishing site I put up was from a month ago. So it's still happening. And I am mindful of time, but I did want to tell a quick cheeky story about $500 million per fraud event. This is a job that me and my team did, the team I was a part of here in Melbourne did, around Citadel, where we basically wrangled in about $570 million from a particular Citadel group. The interesting thing about this job was we were doing target identification, and we're trying to make sure that we understood where our targets were and who they were. And we thought we had them nailed down to this part of the world, which is a city in Russia, and we weren't sure. But then there was a meteorite strike. And then the very next day, they were all on their social media saying, hey, a meteorite hit my town last night. Beautiful, beautiful. We still maintain the only ever recorded event of target identification by celestial event. We still maintain that no one has ever used. This is a piece of the meteorite. We all got challenge coins. I've got a photocopied certificate of authenticity that says that that's a real part of the meteorite. I don't know if it is, but it's a bit of fun. But yeah, so target identification via massive explosion from space. Pretty cool. I know that's been a lot to take in. Good morning, everybody. It's quite late for me. Crystal ball time, where we're going in the future. We've moved these crooks forward along the game. I think we might actually see mobile device fraud start to work. We've seen it be tried before with Marcher and Exobot and Anumis, but Flubot now seems to be the real deal. It actually does seem to be making an impact and seem to be having some type of real, a real chop at using these ubiquitous mobile phones that we've always got, because they've got the technology and they know how to do overlays. They know how to use, WebKit and stuff like that. It's just a matter of them doing it. So now I think, definitely with Flubot, they've learned from the previous almost stunted fits and starts, as it were. And now I think we're about to see something interesting around mobile device malware. Maybe I'm wrong, who knows? So with that whirlwind assault on the senses out of my mouth at you, are we winning? Well, do we win at other crime types? Do we win at drugs? Do we win at guns? Do we win at people smuggling? Crime's crime, but that doesn't mean that we can't have wins. We can't force the bad guys along the path of evolution. We can't force them to go for larger amounts of fraud. So I think we definitely are having wins, but I think we sort of need to stop thinking about winning or losing, because we don't really think about winning or losing in other crime types. But I definitely think that we are winning. We can have wins that will make impacts on them. The money is the key piece. And that's my 20 minutes. I believe, Chris, do we have any questions? Or will I sit here and...
Hello. Yes, thank you, Alex. The good news is we're running slightly ahead of schedule, so we have plenty of time for questions. So we've had a few come in. I guess the first question that came to my mind is, it's that the growth is quite depressing. Do you think we should just give up?
No, yeah, not at all, not at all. And I'm actually glad I've got a bit of time to talk about that up my sleeve. I think that, so if I talk about law enforcement particularly, law enforcement, we played catch up for a long time with this stuff, but we're starting to get the real wins. There are obviously issues with law enforcement and particular management chains and that type of stuff that need to be dealt with, but law enforcement is starting to have wins. I think the interesting part about it is this, I mentioned drugs and guns and other crime types. Cybercrime is really also one of the only crime types that private sector companies and individuals can have a real impact on. And I think that's kind of cool. I mean, I know that like anyone who's worked in government knows there are certain private sector companies that do work with government on these types of things, but en masse, to actually work and to have an impact on a crime type, it's a little bit unique in the cybercrime space. So I think that's good, because we've got more hands working on it. We've got more people trying to understand how these pieces of malware fit together and how to understand how these criminal networks work. So I think working hand in glove with law enforcement is really good. I think we need to sort of take more collaborative action and less unilateral action, shall I say. But I think, yeah, there's definitely room there to have some real good wins, and it's a unique crime type in that respect.
And that segues nicely into another question that we got. In your view, do you think the law enforcement interventions we're seeing are having any effect?
Well, I mean, yeah, that is another great question. I think the people who are in jail think it's affecting them. And I think that's sort of what we can hope for. I think we maybe got a bit used to these big botnet takedowns and big flashy type of events and that sort of stuff. But I think if you look at the people in jail, they definitely feel like they've had an impact on their lives. I know I quite proudly have had an impact on several lives. Those are stories for another time. But yeah, I think definitely there's an impact there. But I think we are a bit used to these big flashy events, which maybe are sort of less likely to happen these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we got, do you think these are the key players? Are they changing over time, or is it different people that are emerging?
There used to be a saying amongst cybercrime investigators and law enforcement that it's the same 500 guys chasing the same 500 guys as it was 10 years ago. I think that was true up until the explosion of ransomware. I think some of those individuals are definitely still involved in ransomware because it's easy money, right? Criminals have got kids to put through school as well, and they haven't been caught yet, so why would they stop, right? So I think they definitely have moved into the happy hunting ground of ransomware, because it's, I often say, come on in, the fraud's lovely. So I think that's definitely happening. But I think the expansion of what we're seeing with ransomware now is definitely sort of showing that there's a lot of new kids on the block who maybe haven't cut their chops so much in learning crime, and they're sort of coming in at the top where a lot of those, as I've said here, a lot of the weaknesses have been ironed out of the criminal landscape. So I think if I was a crook seeing some of these kids come in, I'd sort of be going, they don't know, man, they weren't there for phishing, they don't know anything about it, they just come in straight at lovely distributed and hyper impactful ransomware attacks. You got to cut your chops somewhere. I think maybe that's the old man in me.
One question that's just come in. Why does it continue to be an issue for ISPs to work collectively to block specific IP spaces across allied nations?
Well, That's a great question. I think, honestly, I think I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. I think uh, management comes and goes, and stakeholders come and go, and governmental drivers come and go, and regulations come and go, and things change over the years. And I think if you don't get something in and active and really successful all of a sudden, like now, and if you've got like a longer term plan to get this sort of stuff implemented, you'll find that as the key players in those particular types of collaboration efforts change, things can tend to fall by the wayside a bit. So that's a problem that we see in a lot of different areas of this fight as well. Is that you've got certain key individuals in certain key spots, and if as they move along, yeah, things can fall in a bit of a heap sometimes.
Yeah. A question from me, just to put you on the spot. You've got a big topic, so it's good to give you all the big questions. But what that you can talk about? What was the most surprising thing that you ever saw when you were doing e-crime law enforcement?
I've got some filthy stories about things I saw in houses. No, I won't. The most surprising thing was a person who was doing fraud that wasn't doing fraud, and it was an eye opener to me. It was very early in the days of eBay drop shipping, where you would sell an item to someone for 3 times the price that you'd buy it from someone else online, and just get it shipped directly from that person. The first time I saw that, I was like, I'm in the wrong job. That's like this is very early 2000s. This is back in the day, and I was like, you can do that. All you're doing is making 50% profit or 100% profit, and you're doing nothing at all except sending an email. And I was like, that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting to me, I think. And another one was around someone who was basically using disconnected phone lines to make VoIP trunk calls and charge them at premium rates, because the upshot of that is that bill went nowhere. So no one was paying that bill because the ISP just didn't do anything about it. So he was making an awful lot of money by making these VoIP trunk calls and selling them for a premium rate, but there was no one losing any money. So no one actually wanted to make a criminal complaint.
I'm amazed you're still working with all these ideas, Alex.
I've got a lot of. I think I'm a bit saturated. I sort of always think of the ways that I'd catch myself.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex. That is the last of the questions that we had. Just a reminder to everybody, there is a Q&A tab which you can use to submit questions for us to ask. But thank you, Alex. And then, confusingly, back to other Alex.